introduction. And yes, recording in progress. That's good. It's good to be with all of you. And I don't know that I recognize anyone except, if I'm not mistaken, Ole Olson and I have been in at least together in space before once. You definitely don't forget a name like Ole Olson. It says Minnesota as tater tot hot dish. So good to see you again, Ole. Uh, Allow me a moment to introduce myself formally. Aho Kunamante, ni Dijinji Makwa, Jimber Jacobs, ni Tak Lungamau, ni Mexicanu, and Nakako Satoa, Kunamante, and Nishik Wewe Net. I give you the greetings and I introduce myself as Bear or Jim Bear Jacobs. You can just call me Jim Bear. I am from the Turtle Clan, and as was said in my bio, I am a citizen of the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. And with goodness in my heart, I extend my gratitude for this invitation and for all of you joining me today. So you hear that I'm from the Mohican Nation, and I know in a group this size, there may be at least one person who says, I read a book in high school called The Last of the Mohicans, so how is that even possible? Well, James Fenimore Cooper, God bless him, was a decent fiction writer, and that book, The Last of the Mohicans, is indeed just a work of fiction. Mohicans are a fairly thriving community. Our reservation is presently located about a little over 250 miles east of where I'm currently located, which is in the Twin Cities. Our reservation is in central Wisconsin. However, that is right around 1,000 miles away from our ancestral homeland, which is the Hudson River Valley, from about Manhattan Island up the valley to Lake Champlain in upstate New York. And I am the son of Kathy and Gerald. However, nobody calls him Gerald. He's known as Bear. I'm the grandson of Howard Jacobs and Greta Jacobs. And of all of my titles and accomplishments, those are kind of the most important. I am proud grandson of two incredible human beings who left big shoes to fill, and I endeavor to do my best in that. Today, along this topic of residential boarding schools, I thought I would share some stories with you. Stories of my family and my own experience in interacting primarily with my grandmother on this issue of boarding schools. As Renee said in the intro, please, if I say something that sparks a question in you, please just type that question in the chat. We will be curating those questions, and Renee will kind of do that curation. She'll keep track of the chat, and then my intention is to finish with enough time for hopefully a hearty and robust Q&A / conversation time, so we can really answer any questions or have a meaningful dialogue on this. As you can probably see from my my name on your screen, there is a Reverend, the title in front of my name, and I do work at the Minnesota Council of Churches. And so much of my work is centered on Christian faith communities and the need for us to address racial injustice, particularly within the American Indian community. And that is a very relevant point, especially given this topic. I often get asked in the work that I do, I often get asked why I do this work. And it's not necessarily a question of how did your passion start for this work? What motivates you in the work? There's often more confusion and a fair bit of cynicism behind that question. Why do you do this work? And really, I totally understand where that question comes from, even with its cynicism and confusion attached with it. They're not really asking why, like what motivates me about this work, or what sparked my passion in this work. Really, what they're asking is, given the traumatic history that the Christian church has perpetuated upon American Indian history, given the whole scope of history, I mean, manifest destiny, smallpox blankets, genocide, intentional genocide. Given all of that history, why even bother as an American Indian person? Why even bother giving any attention to the Christian churches? And that is a very fair question. And it's a question that was hard for me to answer for a long time, other than I grew up in the church. I'm third generation Christian on my father's side. I'm fourth generation Christian on my mother's side. And actually on my father's side, the Christianity kind of skipped a couple of generations, but Mohican people, being on the East Coast of the United States, we're a very early contact tribe. And so Christian encounters with Christian peoples and the influence of Christian ideology is very, very early in our interactions with settler contact. And that question of why I do this, totally fair question. And really, to answer that question, to give an adequate answer to that question, I need to introduce you to my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1922. She lived until the age of 95. She was, in every aspect of the word, an absolutely incredible human being. Definitely the most influential person in my life. She was just beautiful. My grandmother, in heels, not that she ever wore heels, but my grandmother in heels would stand about 4'9" tall. Just a tiny, tiny woman. Uh, but I promise you, if you ever crossed that small woman, she would kick your ass faster than you knew what was happening. And if she heard me use the word ass in public, like I just did, she would kick my ass. She was a feisty woman. Just every every memory I have with my grandmother, she was so full of life and vigor and passion. Really beautiful human being. And one of my favorite things to do when I would visit with my grandmother um, was just put her in the car and take her on a drive. And one day there was a significant family gathering at my grandmother's, and so I'm sure you can imagine what these family gatherings are like. Cousins came in from the Dakotas, and an aunt came in from the East Coast, and her humble home on the reservation was just a blur of activity. And there was kind of the best way to describe it. It was just a beautiful chaos that was surrounding uh, the home. And and I was sitting in the living room, and Grandma was sitting directly across the living room from me in her chair. And I noticed that Grandma looked, a little tired, a little a little done with all of the drama, if you can understand. And it's not, please understand, it's not like it was bad drama. It was just the chaos of all the people and all of the family. And Grandma looked like she had had about enough and could use a break. And so I snuck over to her and I said, Grandma, do you want to get out of here and go for a drive? She perked up a little bit and she said, yeah, let's be real quiet and sneak out because I don't want any of them following us. And so we snuck outside and got to my car. I put Grandma in the passenger seat and then got behind the wheel. We drove down her driveway, and she had not an insignificant driveway. It was, you know how these country driveways are. They can be uh, longer than you want to shovel kind of driveways. And um, our drives, whenever we would do this little ritual of going for a drive, our drives always started the same way. We'd get to the end of her driveway, and I would say, okay, do we go right or do we go left? And whatever direction she chose, the end result was always the same. As we would pull out of her driveway onto the road, her mouth would open and story after story would just come flooding out of her tiny body. And we would drive in one direction and we would get to another intersection and I would ask her, do we go right or do we go left? And around every turn and every bend in the road, another story would emerge from her. You see, at this point, Grandma was 90 years old. She had lived on the reservation her entire life. You see, the Mohican Nation in central Wisconsin is only 26,000 acres. It literally is a tiny dot on the map of Wisconsin. And Grandma had spent at this point almost every day of her 90 years somewhere within that 26,000 acre reservation. She had 9 decades of relationship with this land. She had 9 decades of interaction with this place. She had 9 decades of stories that she had experienced with this land. And as we would drive around as I said, every bend in the road, every crossing of a creek had another story. And these were some of my favorite times with my grandmother. I just cherish these times, just her and I together driving down the road and her just regaling me with story after story. And I had to train myself early on when we started this little ritual of driving and story. I had to train myself early on to pay attention to the road, but probably pay more attention to her because grandma was the type of elder person that if you tried to record any of her stories, she would just clam up and she wouldn't talk. And so I never did record my grandmother, but I would listen with such attention to just soak it all in. And I love these times. And we drove around that reservation for a good 2.5 hours, just all over. And we would drive down and if you know anything about central Wisconsin, it's what we commonly refer to as the big woods. It's a heavily wooded area, so much so that it was uh, the primary industry in the area was logging, timber logging, and so um, all of these main roads are crisscrossed with what we call old logging roads, which are just um, to call them roads is being incredibly generous. They are just literally two tire tracks that go tire ruts that go off into the woods. And it's along these old roads that 60, 70 years ago, the big logging trucks would go in and haul the lumber out. And they're virtually impassable now, but grandma would take me up an old logging road because there's a story back there and she wanted to tell me that story. And, honestly, what the hell did she care? Because it was my car being ripped apart on the logging road and not hers. And so we'd go bounding down the logging road and try to find a way to come back out and just on and on this afternoon, just like that. And as I said, we were driving for 2.5 hours, story after story. And I honestly, I don't know how or if she even took a breath because it was just constant. I hope you have someone in your life that's like that, that will just, when you're alone, just give you story after story and just share with you in such a beautiful and intimate way. And as I said, the reservation is only 26,000 acres, which means in 2.5 hours, you're going to see pretty much every part of the reservation. You're running out of reservation. And I didn't want this to end. And I got the sense that grandma didn't necessarily want to go back to the chaos of grandkids and nephews and all of that. And so I was trying to find a way to extend our time together. And I said, Grandma, do you want to go visit Grandpa? And she said, I'd really like that. Nobody really takes me out there anymore. So Grandpa had walked on and passed away a number of years prior to this. And he was buried in a cemetery about 15 to 20 miles off the reservation. And yeah, Grandma said, I'd like that. Nobody takes me out there anymore. And so I turned the car around and we headed down that country road towards the cemetery. And again, that whole drive down that road, there's more stories. There's more stories. We passed by this old farmhouse, and she tells me how one day, uh, during one year, the farmer that owned that farm got the idea that the money wasn't just in beef cattle, but it was in the Texas Longhorn cattle. And so here were these completely out of place Texas Longhorn cattle in a Wisconsin farm. And they sure did cause a lot of havoc when they broke through the fence. And wandered into the nearby town. And we finally arrive at the cemetery. And I'm sure you can all appreciate this when I say, in every way imaginable, it was the stereotypical old country cemetery. Um, there was a stone fence, the old field stone or flagstone fence that borders creates a barrier between the the burial plots and the road. There was a small building that served as both the chapel and the maintenance shed, where the groundskeepers would keep their equipment. And we pulled up into the parking lot, small dirt gravel parking lot, and I walked over to the passenger side of the car and I opened my grandmother's door and offered her my arm. And I started walking towards Grandpa's grave, which was over in this direction. And Grandma was trying to pull me in this direction. And I would try to correct, going over to where my grandpa was, and she's going in this direction. And I said, Grandma, Grandpa's over here. And I never saw the hand that came up and slapped me on the back of the head as she said, Boy, don't you think I know where my husband is? Now get your butt over here because I want to tell you about this person here. And we stopped in front of a grave. And she told me a story about the person buried here. And we moved to another grave. She told me the story about this person buried here. And it quickly dawned on me that my grandmother had a story for almost everyone in this cemetery. And she knew personally almost everyone in this cemetery. And she would tell me story after story as we hopscotched around the gravestones, just more and more stories. And she told me how many years ago, a few decades ago, when the county had to widen the dirt road in front of the cemetery, they had to move that fieldstone wall in away from the road a little bit. And to accommodate that, they simply just picked up the headstones and moved them a few feet in. They left the bodies where they were, but just adjusted the headstones. And so now that there are people actually buried under the fence, and she knows exactly who was buried under the fence and told me stories about them. We stopped at one grave and she told me, This is so and so. And he had a brother who was just a few years older than him. And this brother is buried in this corner of the cemetery, and his brother is buried in the complete opposite corner of the cemetery because these two brothers could never get along in life, and they sure as heck were not going to get along in death. So the decision was made to bury them as far apart as they possibly could. And for about another hour, this was my experience as we just walked past another grave and another story and another grave and another story until finally we had gone around almost the entire perimeter of this country cemetery and we arrived in front of my grandfather's grave. And my grandmother was on my arm and I walked her up till she was standing in front of my grandfather's grave, and she dropped my arm and I took a few steps back to give her some privacy. They had been married for 52 years, and I figured they probably had some stuff to talk about. And I'm standing just a few steps behind her, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you want to give someone their privacy, so you're not actively listening, but she is 90 years old, and so I have to listen a little bit because what if she needs something? And so I'm sitting there doing my best to not listen to the conversation she's having with my grandfather, but also being attentive just in case she might need something. And it was at that point that my grandmother just looked over her shoulder and spoke to me, and just as nonchalantly as possible, she pointed behind me and she said, "Over there is where I went to school." And I turned around and I looked, and about a mile across this empty field, I could see in the distance these buildings that were standing there. And I had never noticed them before. I'd been in this cemetery dozens of times. Almost everyone who's died in my entire family is buried in this cemetery. But I had never noticed those buildings about a mile across the field behind me. And Grandma finishes up her conversation with my grandfather, and I return and give her my elbow. We walk back to the car. And as we walk back to the car, I said, "Grandma, um, do you think we could go and visit your school?" And she said, yeah, we can do that. Now, up until this point, I knew exactly two things about my grandmother's education. I knew that she went away for school, and I knew that she attended until the eighth grade. And that's it. And I mean, you all remember those assignments when you're in right around middle school where you have to interview an elder. Well, grandma was always my elder that I interviewed. And any question I ever asked about her schooling was met with, "I went away to school and I only went to the eighth grade." That was it. There was no more conversation about her schooling. But now I see the buildings standing in the distance, and we get in the car. And even though it's only about a mile across this field to actually get there on these old Wisconsin country roads, is probably about a 4 mile journey. So you have to go down and around and come back up. And again, the whole time we're talking, or the whole time we're driving, my grandmother is sharing more stories. And we pull up finally uh, in front of the buildings. And I get out and I offer grandma my arm. And this time I let her lead me. I learned my lesson, didn't want to get thumped on the head again. And grandma's leading me around. And I remember she first went up to this old, huge maple tree. And she laid her hand against that maple tree, almost like someone who's greeting a loved one they haven't seen in a long time. She laid her hands on that tree, and she led me over to one of the buildings, and she reached out to touch the stone facade of the building, um and almost before she even touched it, she recoiled her hand, just like someone would on a dry day when they get an electric shock when they touch a door handle. She recoiled her hand. She led me around that small little campus. And if you've ever seen photos of these historic residential boarding schools, you know they almost always look the same. There's a large building that serves as a chapel and classrooms. There's a dormitory, sometimes two dormitories where the students lived. And the most elaborate building was the headmaster's quarters, where the headmaster lived, and occasionally some of the teachers would live there too. And so there wasn't a lot to explore, just a few buildings. And we had been walking around um, this small campus for probably about 30 minutes when all of a sudden I had this realization that, well, it almost punched me in the gut. I got this sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. Felt like my breath had been taken away as I realized that in this entire 30 minutes that we had been walking around this campus, my grandmother was not talking, not one word. We walked around that campus for 30 minutes in complete silence. And when you take that in contrast to the 3.5 hours that we had just spent together, where for 3.5 hours, this woman, I swear to God, did not take a breath. So filled with stories that poured out of her tiny body. Story after story after story. And now, silence. In the shadows of these God-forsaken buildings, she was silent. No words. Upon realizing this, I said, Grandma, do you want to get out of here? She silently nodded. And I walked Grandma back to the car, put her in the passenger seat. And rather than take the normal way I do around the front of the car, I took the longer way around the back of the car, pretended to check something the back of the car so that I could stuff my tears back in my eyes. I got in the car and we drove away. And when we made that first turn and those buildings were no longer visible in any of our mirrors, she opened her mouth again, told me more stories all the way back home. And it was on that day when the necessity of this work was made imminently manifest in my life. And when I am asked, why do you do this work? With all of the skepticism and reasonable questions, why do I do this work? Why bother with the church? I think back to that day with my grandmother. Because on the top of that building that my grandmother couldn't even touch was a cross. That school stole my grandmother's voice. This woman who had 90 years of stories that she was just waiting for an opportunity to get out for 3.5 hours that afternoon. I could not get a word in edgewise. In the shadows of those buildings, she was silent, could not speak. That school, that institution, with the cross on top of the building, they stole her voice. And I do this work because I'm coming back for her voice. I am reclaiming her voice. I do this work because someone needs to hold the church accountable. And trust me when I say this, and I mean this with no offense intended for anyone here who may be a believer in the Christian faith, who attends church. Someone needs to hold the church accountable, and I can't trust the church to hold themselves accountable. So that's why I do this work, because I'm coming for my grandmother's voice. While I'm sharing stories of my grandmother, I want to share another one. My grandmother, as I said, full of life, beautiful smile, laughter just would roll from her belly and fill a room. But whenever it came time for that we wanted a picture, my grandmother would always just look down at the floor, like always. If ever we caught my grandmother in a candid smile or mid laugh, we had to sneak that photograph. Because if she knew that her picture was being taken, she would just look down at the floor. And it's not just from my lifetime. In almost every photograph we have of my grandmother, going back to the old black and white photos from the 1940s, everyone in that photograph will be looking at the camera and smiling as big as life, and grandma is just looking down. And it kind of became a family joke at Christmas time and family reunions. We're like, oh, we're gonna get a photograph, grandma. Make sure your shoes are tied, because she would just look down, and we would tease her a little bit good naturedly, just give her a little teasing. And one day, as I was um, just doing a little research on boarding schools, and um, one of the pictures, or one of the types of pictures that will always come up if ever you Google boarding schools, one of the pictures or types of pictures that will always come up is the before and after pictures of the students. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can find a plethora of these images on Google, but they all essentially look the same. You have the savage native children in their traditional garb and their long hair, their whatever significant cultural objects they're wearing, jewelry or ceremonial items, they're wearing all of these, and they're taking a picture is taken of them looking at the camera, and then you have that. So that's the before picture, and then you have the after picture, which is clean face, cut hair, all of the traditional regalia and traditional clothing and cultural items have now disappeared, and the boys are wearing business suits essentially, and the girls are wearing dresses. And again, the hair is cut and the skin has been washed, and that's the before and after picture. And um, what a lot of people don't know is that usually those pictures were taken on the same day. So it's not like one is an entrance picture and one is a graduation picture. They're literally, some of them, taken mere hours apart. And as I was scrolling through these images that I just popped up in an image search, I had this realization. My grandmother was born in 1922. She was taken to residential boarding school around 1927, at the age of 5. And it is entirely likely that her first ever encounter and experience with the camera was that picture. That picture. And very often with the younger children, when they took these pictures, because the young children didn't know really the function of a camera, most definitely an incredibly traumatic day. Very often, someone who worked at the school would actually physically hold their head facing the camera until right at the moment the photographer would say 1, 2, 3, and then that assistant would release their hands and jump out of the frame and capture that picture. Can you imagine? Most traumatic day of your life, and someone is holding your head up to face a camera. And I'm sure that that was my grandmother's first ever experience with a camera. Given that experience, is it really any wonder at all that any time a camera would come out and she was conscious of it, is it any wonder that she didn't want to look at it? And I carry the regret that I participated in the good-natured making fun of my grandmother. Little jab, tiny amount of ridicule. I mean, that's who we were as a family. I mean, sarcasm is a love language in our family, but I carry that regret because knowing what I know now, I would never try to force my grandmother to stare into the camera for the sake of a picture. I want to just share a couple of images with you. Um, these are some images. I'll explain them as they come up. So when I previewed this, just to test and make sure that I could share my screen, Renee noticed my title, Lament in the Day of Resurrection. I must confess that most of this presentation was actually put together last year, right around Easter. I don't know, I was giving another presentation in Eastern Pennsylvania, and I'll kind of explain that in a little bit. I don't know what it is about the Easter time that I get asked to speak about boarding schools. But this title was actually chosen last year around this time, Lament in the Day of Resurrection. Maybe it's fitting that here we are the day after Easter, revisiting this. Actually, I apologize. This might have been 2 years ago. I think this was 2 years ago around Easter time. I was invited 2 years ago out to Western Pennsylvania, excuse me, Eastern Pennsylvania, again to talk about residential boarding schools and the trauma. I was invited by the Eastern Pennsylvania United Church of Christ. And I was given the option to either go give the presentation in person, or I could do it through Zoom. And uniquely, they offered me the same amount for either one. But I said, you know, if you pay my travel expenses, I would prefer to do this in person. And trust me, you want me to do this in person. I'm a much better presenter in person than I am through Zoom. But if you bring me out there, I'm going to require an extra day. You have to give me an extra day so that I can go visit Carlisle. Maybe you've heard of Carlisle. Carlisle, Pennsylvania is a town in the Shenandoah Valley of Pennsylvania. But Carlisle is the place of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the boarding school. And my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, was taken off the reservation and sent to Carlisle. And I said, I would much prefer to come in person, but I have a stipulation. If you bring me out in person, you have to give me an extra day because I'm going to go visit Carlisle. And the minister who was inviting me maybe didn't quite have a grasp of what I was asking, because she said, "Oh, yeah, that's great. You know, where we're meeting is in Allentown, and Carlisle's, you know, I can't remember how far away, but it's pretty close. So we could even just move the whole gathering to Carlisle." And I was like, wait, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm not bringing you to Carlisle. I'm going to Carlisle, and you're not. I am going there for myself. I'm not going there to process any trauma in front of you. And when she figured out what I was asking, she's like, yeah, that makes sense. And so my partner and I flew out. We landed, and we built that extra day on the front end of the trip. And so we went to Carlisle before the presentation, one of the following days. And if you don't know Carlisle, this is a photo of the Indian boarding school, the residential boarding school at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was opened 1869 or 1870. It was opened under the direction of Colonel Henry Pratt. Colonel Henry Pratt had, well, he most popularly in this context is known for coming up with the motto that you have to kill the Indian in order to save the child. And Carlisle Indian Industrial School became the model by which residential boarding schools were operated. This was funded by the U.S. government, and from this point on, most residential boarding schools were a collaborative effort between the United States government and a Christian denomination. But at least 10,000 Native children were taken to Carlisle. And as my partner Shannon and I were driving in our rental car into Carlisle, as I said, you come down into the Shenandoah Valley, and it just struck me that this is what my great grandfather would have seen. This valley, which is 900 miles away from his home, 900 miles away from his parents, 900 miles away from his family. Now, Carlisle was operated on an active military base. And as you get closer to Carlisle, you cross over some railroad tracks. And as we crossed over, I just had this punch in the gut kind of feeling that this is probably how my great grandfather arrived at Carlisle, loaded on a train, shipped halfway across the country. And as you drive by, or as you approach Carlisle, it is still an active military base, which means there's a restrictive fence that goes all the way around the base. And as you drive the road that goes out in front past the entrance to Carlisle, really the first thing you notice is a small graveyard. Those of us who had any familiarity with Carlisle know exactly what that graveyard is. It is the graves of children who were taken to Carlisle and never made it home. And I saw those graves, and they it looks just like a very tiny Arlington National Cemetery or Fort Snelling Military Cemetery. They are the white marble government headstones, military headstones. And I parked the car kind of across the street. There's a field there, a park. Parked the car across the street. And my partner asked me, do you want me to come with you? And I said, no, I think I need to sit here by myself for a while. So she sat in the car as I got out, and I just sat in that field and I stared at those headstones and I just wept. And I don't know how long I spent there, but I came back to the car and we drove up to the gated entrance of the military base, and you got to go through the background check and everything to enter. And I said to the guard, I said, we're here to visit the cemetery, and I said, do you know if any of the buildings from the boarding school days are still here? And he says, I don't know. He said, but the base itself is built like concentric rings. So the closer you get to the center, the further back in time you're going. And I said, okay. And so we stopped right there on the other side of the fence and we walked that small cemetery. And it's just, it's sobering and it's sickening as you look, as some of these children, you do the math, are 10 or 11 years old. And the headstones all pretty much follow the same format. If a name is known, the name is recorded. If it's not, it just says unknown. And then it says a tribal affiliation. So you have Ojibwe, Sioux. And you get this realization that some of these children were being taken from places that weren't even states yet. And they never made it home. And I knew from doing my doing a little bit of research, I knew that there were no Mohican people buried in that cemetery. I knew that none of my own people were buried in that cemetery, but I went through this little ritual. See, Mohican people were related to a lot of different tribes. It's what happens when you share a geographic area with other people. There's intermarriage in that. And so the Mohican people, we are related to the Ojibwe, we're related to the Seneca, we're related to the Oneida, we're related to just basically any tribe that was in that northeast section of the country at the time. And so we had stopped at a store and I got a little bit of tobacco so that as we walked through the cemetery, I could lay a tobacco offering on um, any grave that I would share a kinship relationship with. And so any Ojibwe person I laid a bit of tobacco on. There was one Seneca child I laid tobacco on, and then I stopped dead in my tracks because there is an Oneida child buried in that cemetery. And the Oneida, even today, in our relocated home, central Wisconsin, the Oneida are 40 miles from us. And they were in close proximity in our ancestral homelands along the Hudson River Valley in upstate New York. So the Oneida and the Mohican have a kinship relationship that goes back thousands upon thousands of years. And I saw this Oneida child, and the name I recognized, the last name, the family name. It is the family name that is in common use on my reservation today. It is a family name in which I share family lineage with. My father grew up, went to school with children who have this family name, and it just struck me. This child was, I believe, 7 years old, never made it home. Someone I'm related to. And as we walked out of the cemetery, we started driving further into these concentric circles, moving further back in time. And my eyes are peeled, and I thought, I wonder if I'll recognize the buildings if they even stand. And came around this corner, and sure enough, this building right here that you see behind these hundreds of children, this building still stands. Another picture of that building. This building still stands. It was a dormitory building. It's still there. It's still in use. As we walked around, there's just an incredible disconnect because this building right here, which served as a dormitory for children, is now the barracks for active duty military. And this was a fairly beautiful, in terms of the temperature, it was a fairly beautiful summer evening that we were there. So as we were walking around, walking past this building, the military barracks, which now houses active duty military, windows were open and I could hear just the mundane activity of life going on inside. And I don't know how to reconcile that. You know, your spirit does things as you realize, if you know the story of a place, you know that this is a place of incredible trauma. And now through an open window, you hear the festivities of Wheel of Fortune being played over the TV. And it's just, there's a disconnect. Like how can life just continue when the stories and the ghosts walk this place? So I just wanted to share these pictures with you, and in a minute, um, I'll conclude and we can have some conversation. These are some photos of that residential boarding school that my grandmother was taken to. This is in a small town called Red Springs, Wisconsin. This is a dormitory building. This would have served as a dormitory. I believe the boys were on the top level and the girls were on the bottom level, or vice versa. But it's a dormitory building. That large maple tree, unfortunately, I didn't think to get a picture of it, but it's off to, as you're looking at it, it's off to the right here. You can see that chapel building to the left. This is the headmaster's building. It's a little run down now, but you can see it is a sizable house. It's another view of that chapel building. The cross that I mentioned has been taken down. It's it either just fell down or it's might be being refurbished or otherwise restored to go back up there. But yeah, these are those photos, and stop sharing. And so when we hear stories like this, I think our first impulse is to ask ourselves, what can we do about it? You can't deny the trauma. You can't deny the generational impact that this has. And so a natural question is, what can we do about it? And in my work in intersecting and interacting with churches over a decade and a half of speaking about this, that is a question I get asked all the time from pastors and bishops and whatnot. And my first response is always this. You need to commit a significant portion of your budget to Indigenous language and cultural reclamation efforts in your area. And I say significant because I want churches to feel this. And if given the opportunity, I always go a little further into explanation. And I say, notice I said significant. I want you to feel this. And I don't want what churches usually do. I don't want a special offering. I don't want anything to come out of your benevolence fund or your Samaritan fund or your community charity fund or whatever you call it. I don't want that. I want a dedicated line in your budget. I want you to discuss this at every annual church business meeting. This is not charity. This is not benevolence. This is an obligation that the church has, as much as your obligation to pay your pastor's salary and to keep the lights on. This is an obligation. And I say significant because I want you to feel this. I'm speaking to churches. I want you to feel this. I want this to cost you something because it cost me everything. Language and cultural reclamation projects. Why? Because residential boarding school is where American Indian culture went to die. Kill the Indian to save the child. It is where culture went to die. It is where language went to die. Unfortunately, sadly, it is where children went to die. I want this to cost you something because it cost me everything. Because when I greeted you this evening in the Mohican language, that is the sum total of the Mohican language that I know. I know just enough to introduce myself. Because for my generation, and certainly my father's generation, the Mohican language was almost dead. I know just enough of my Indigenous language to greet you and introduce myself. For generations, the rest of the Mohican language laid buried in that cemetery, a mile across an empty field from that school. And with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank you for your engagement. To those of you who are on camera, I can see that the story is landing and it's impacting, and you are sitting with it. And I just want to thank you for your willingness to engage in what can oftentimes be an uncomfortable listening and conversation. And I am going to hand it off to Renee. I don't know if you want to do your breakout.
We'll just go. Yeah, I think we'll just do discussion in the breakout rooms.
Okay.
But I just want to say that one of the things that I was struck by in your conversation was that you sat and with those graves and cried for those children. And I think it's something that we often don't do in our culture today. We kind of hurry past it and say that's sad, and we don't take time to really grieve for it. So I think that's a really valuable lesson. So I did have one question, and you can ponder on this, and if you want to say something when we come back from the breakout rooms. The question was that how do we support and help our Indigenous community members, especially given that they're so invisible in our communities a lot of times. And so I'm going to, with that, put us in breakout rooms. We'll be there for 10 minutes. Then we'll come back and do a little bit of wrap up. And if Jim Bear has an answer to that question, that's a big question, but anything you want to share about it, we'll do that at that time. Does that sound good to you? All right. And as always, if you want to go to the breakout room, you can. And if you decide you would rather stay out here with me, that is totally fine. And I gave Jim Bear the same option to go into the breakout room. So I had posted questions you can talk about. They were in this chat. You won't be able to see them when you get to the breakout room. But you can talk about whatever struck you, questions you have, thoughts you have, you want to share with others. So with that, the rooms are open, and I will see you back in 10 minutes.